All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Angela Y. Davis's Women, Race, and Class. We are on the middle of page 155. Ella Reeve Bloor. Born in 1862, the remarkable labor organizer and agitator for women's rights, black equality, peace, and socialism, who was popularly known as, quote, Mother, end quote, Bloor, became a member of the Socialist Party soon after it was founded. She went on to become a socialist leader and a living legend for the working class across the country. Hitchhiking from one end of the United States to the other, she became the heart and soul of untold numbers of strikes. Streetcar operators in Philadelphia heard her first strike speeches. In other parts of the country, miners, textile workers, and sharecroppers were among the workers who benefited from her astounding oratorical talents and her powerful skills as an organizer. At the age of 62, Mother Bloor was still thumbing rides from one state to another. When she was 78, Mother Bloor published the story of her life as a labor organizer from her pre-socialist days through the period of her Communist Party membership. As a socialist, her working class consciousness did not include an explicit awareness of black people's special oppression. As a communist, however, Mother Bloor fought numerous manifestations of racism and urged others to follow her example. In 1920, for example, when the International Labor Defense held its convention in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, quote, we had engaged rooms for all the delegates in the Monongahela Hotel. When we arrived late at night with 25 Negro delegates, the manager of the hotel said that while they could stay there that night, they must all get out immediately the next morning. Next morning, we voted that the whole convention should adjourn to the hotel in an orderly fashion. We marched to the hotel carrying banners emphasizing, quote, no discrimination, end quote. We filed into the lobby, which by that time was filled with newspapermen, policemen, and curious crowds, end quote. During the early 1930s, Mother Bloor addressed a meeting in Loop City, Nebraska in support of women who had struck against their poultry farm employers. The strike assembly was violently assaulted by a racist mob opposed to the presence of black people at the meeting. When the police arrived, Mother Bloor was arrested, together with the black woman and her husband. The black woman, Mrs. Floyd Booth, was a leading member of the local anti-war committee, and her husband was an activist in the town's unemployed council. When the local farmers raised sufficient bail money to obtain Mother Bloor's release, she refused their aid, insisting that she would not leave until both Booths could accompany her. Quote, I felt I could not accept the bail and leave the two Negro comrades in jail in an atmosphere so dangerously charged with bitter hate of Negroes. End quote. During this period, Mother Bloor organized a U.S. delegation to attend an international women's conference in Paris. 4 of the women included in the delegation were black. Quote, Capitola Tasker, Alabama sharecropper, tall and graceful, the life of the whole delegation. Lulia Jackson, elected by the Pennsylvania miners, a woman who represented the mothers of the Scottsboro boys, and Mabel Byrd, a brilliant young honor graduate of the University of Washington who had a position with the International Labor Office in Geneva, end quote. At the 1934 Paris Conference, Capitola Tasker was one of the 3 U.S. women elected to serve as a member of the Assembly's Executive Committee, along with Mother Bloor and the woman representing the Socialist Party. Mabel Byrd, the black college graduate, was elected as one of the conference secretaries. Lulia Jackson, the black representative of Pennsylvania miners, emerged as one of the Paris Women's Conference's leading personalities. In her persuasive response to the pacifist faction attending the gathering, she argued that support for the war against fascism was the sole means of guaranteeing a meaningful peace. During the course of the women's deliberations, a committed pacifist had complained, quote, I think there is too much about fighting in that anti-war manifesto. It says fight against war, fight for peace, fight, 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 fight. We are women, we are mothers, we don't want to fight. We know that even when our children are bad, we are nice to them, and we win them by love, not by fighting them, end quote. Lulia Jackson's counter-argument was forthright and lucid. quote, "Ladies, it has just been said that we must not fight, that we must be gentle and kind to our enemies, to those who are for war. I can't agree with that. Everyone knows the cause of war. It is capitalism. We can't just give those bad capitalists their supper and put them to bed the way we do with our children. We must fight them." End quote. As Mother Bloor relates in her autobiography, quote, "Everyone laughed and applauded, even the pacifists," end quote, and the anti-war manifesto was consequently approved by the entire body. When the conference was addressed by Capitola Tasker, the black sharecropper from Alabama, they heard her compare the current European fascism with the racist terror suffered by black people in the United States. Having vividly described the Southern and mob murders, she acquainted the Paris delegates with the violent repression aimed at sharecroppers who were attempting to organize in Alabama. Her own opposition to fascism ran deep, so Capitola Tasker explained, for she herself had already been victimized by its terrible ravages. She concluded her speech with the, quote, "Sharecroppers' song," end quote, which she adapted to fit the occasion. "Like a tree that's standing by the water, we shall not be moved. We're against war and fascism. We shall not be moved." As the U.S. delegation returned home by boat, Mother Bloor recorded Capitola Tasker's moving testimony about her Paris experiences. Quote, "Mother, when I get back to Alabama and go out to that cotton patch back of our little old shack, I'll stand there thinking to myself, Capitola, did you really go over there to Paris and see all those wonderful women and hear all those great talks? Or was it just a dream that you were over there? And if it turns out that it really wasn't a dream, why, Mother, I'm just going to broadcast all over Alabama all that I've learned over here and tell them how women from all over the world are fighting to stop the kind of terror we have in the South and to stop war." End quote. As Mother Bloor and her Communist Party comrades concluded, the working class cannot assume its historical role as a revolutionary force if workers do not struggle relentlessly against the social poison of racism. The long list of stunning accomplishments associated with the name of Ella Reeve Bloor reveals that this white communist woman was a deeply principled ally of the Black liberation movement. And that brings us to the ending of that passage, which was about Ella Reeve Bloor. And I think the things that stands out to me in that passage is, once again, this is a woman who I had no knowledge about, and so I'm thankful to be introduced to this woman, introduced to some of her accomplishments, to some of her beliefs and ideologies. Again, you see the commonality here, which we've seen in this chapter multiple times, even though we began reading this chapter on a previous episode. But we've seen in this chapter multiple times and in this book multiple times women being arrested for standing up for equality, for equity, for standing against discrimination. And again, that just points to the false notion of why police exist in our society. And it again is this notion of protecting and serving, but who is being protected and who is being served, and specifically, not even who, but what is being protected and what is being served. And as you see in this specific book, that it is the status quo that is being protected and being served, the status quo that was set up to marginalize women, the status quo that was set up to subjugate women, the status quo that was set up to marginalize workers, the status quo that was set up to exploit workers, the status quo that was set up to discriminate against black people, discriminate against black women. And you see how these police officers regularly are being deployed to uphold that status quo, to uphold that discrimination. And I think that we have to do the work of questioning why so often in history, when people are standing on the right side of history, it is law enforcement and police that are used and deployed to try to get those people to stand down and to try to get those people to surrender their beliefs. I think another one of the things that stands out from what we just read here was the intersectionality between working working class and the things that and the class struggles that existed, and then the kind of struggles that were existing when it came to women's liberation, and then the kind of struggles that were existing when it came to racism, and how black women specifically, because of the fact that being black at the time that they were black meant they didn't have equal opportunities for employment, being women at the time that they were women meant they didn't have equal opportunities of employment. They fell into these three intersections of being in the working class or the poor class, being women, and being black, and they had to suffer the discrimination that came with all of those things. And I think that we have to understand how many people in our society deal with these multiple layers of intersectionality again, and I think I've emphasized this regularly throughout this book, so that way when we're forming ideologies, when we're forming tactics and forming organizations and forming movements, we don't mimic the same type of discrimination that we see in mainstream society. And we understand that we can't simply just be speaking for black men, but we must be speaking for black people as a whole. And we can't simply be speaking for middle class black people, but we must be speaking for all classes of black people as a whole. And so I'm going to take a moment to end this segment, and we're going to continue on with this episode. I'm going to stop, but this is going to pick right back up. All right, let's continue reading. We are on page 159. Anita Whitney. When Anita Whitney was born in 1867 to a wealthy San Francisco family, no one would have suspected that she would eventually be the chairperson of the California Communist Party. Perhaps she was destined to become a political activist, for as a fresh graduate of Wellesley, the prestigious New England Women's College, she did volunteer charity and settlement housework and soon became an active champion of women's suffrage. Upon her return to California, Anita Whitney joined the Equal Suffrage League and was elected president in time to see her state become the sixth in the nation to extend the vote to women. In 1914, Anita Whitney joined the Socialist Party. Despite her party's posture of relative indifference toward black people's struggles, she readily supported anti-racist causes. When the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded, Whitney enthusiastically agreed to serve as a member of its executive committee. Having identified with the positions of left-wing members of the Socialist Party, she joined those who established the Communist Labor Party in 1919. Shortly thereafter, this group merged with the Communist Party, USA. 1919 was the year of the infamous anti-communist raids initiated by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Anita was destined to become one of the many victims of the Palmer raids. She was informed that a speech she was scheduled to deliver before club women associated with the Oakland Center of California Civic League had been banned by the authorities. But despite the official prohibition, she spoke on November 28, 1919 about, quote, the Negro problem in the United States, end quote. Her remarks were sharply focused on the issue of lynching. Quote, since 1890, when our statistics have their beginning, there have occurred in these United States 3,228 lynchings, 2,500 of colored men, and 50 of colored women. I would that I could leave the subject with these bare facts recording numbers, but I feel that we must face all the barbarity of the situation in order to do our part in blotting this disgrace from our country's record, end quote. She went on to pose a question to the audience of white club women. Did they know that, quote, a colored man once said that if he owned hell in Texas, he would prefer to rent out Texas and live in hell, end quote. His reasoning, she explained in a serious vein, was based on the fact that Texas could claim the third largest number of racist mob murders committed throughout the southern states. Only Georgia and Mississippi could boast of more. In 1919, it was still something of a rarity for a white person to appeal to others of her race to stand up against the scourge of lynching. The generalized racist propaganda and the repeated evocation of the mythical black rapist in particular had resulted in the desired division and alienation. Even in progressive circles, white people were often hesitant to speak out against lynchings since they were justified as unfortunate reactions to black sexual attacks against white womanhood in the South. Anita Whitney was one of those white people whose vision remained clear despite the power of the prevailing racist propaganda. And she was willing to risk the consequences of her anti-racist stance. Although it was clear that she would be arrested, she chose to speak about lynchings to the white Oakland club women. Sure enough, she was taken into custody at the conclusion of her speech and was charged by the authorities with criminal syndicalism. The words that I'm not pronouncing right, I'm going to start trying to spell. So it's SYNDICALISM. I'll look that word up after I get done reading. If you come across a word when you're reading that you don't know, you should look up the definition. Whitney was later convicted and sentenced to San Quentin Prison, where she spent several weeks before her release on appeal bond. It was not until 1927 that Anita Whitney was pardoned by the governor of California. As a 20th century white woman, Anita Whitney was indeed a pioneer in the struggle against racism. Together with her black comrades, she and others like her would forge the Communist Party's strategy for working class emancipation. In this strategy, the fight for black liberation would be a central ingredient. In 1936, Anita Whitney became the state chairperson of the Communist Party of California and was elected soon thereafter to serve on the party's national committee. Quote, once she was asked, Anita, how do you regard the Communist Party? What has it come to mean to you? Quote, why, end quote, she smiled incredulously, a bit taken aback by such an amazing question. Quote, why, it has given purpose to my life. The Communist Party is the hope of the world, end quote. And as I pointed out with the last couple of passages that we've read, sorry, I'm pronouncing those P's a little too hard. As I spoke about with some of the last couple of passages that we read, I think the thing that stands out the most to me about this is just the life of Anita that is written here. I did not know about Anita Whitney before reading through this passage in this chapter. I hope to read and find out more about her. And again, this book specifically continues to show history and show some of these issues from a perspective, from a woman's perspective, instead of what is predominantly the history is told from the perspective of the male participants. I think another one of the things that stands out to me is the type of courage that it took for all of these women to openly be coming out and stating that they were communists, to openly be coming out and working in communist parties and espousing communist ideology at a time when just the connotation with communism was something that was so negative, and that just being connected with communism or the people who may be considered communists, as was pointed out here, could land you in prison, could land you in jail. I think during this same time period, a lot of people were being deported out of America because of their communist beliefs. And again, one of the things that is pointed out here as a regularity when we start speaking about police terrorism and mass incarceration is how police officers and the institution of policing and law enforcement are used to maintain the status quo, how they are used to maintain not a peaceful order or equitable or just order, but to maintain an oppressive order and an exploitative order. And so we see here how just by speaking, this woman, Anita Whitney, was arrested and then sentenced to prison. And it wasn't until time passed that she was even pardoned for the charge that she had. And so again, we see when people say things like freedom of speech exists in this country, or we have free speech in this country, one of the things that has to be pointed out is how many people have not had the ability to have free speech, and how often that speech is free when it is something that does not upset whatever the order is at the time when the speech is being espoused. It's not necessarily about whether the speech is right or wrong. It's about does it do anything to shift the order or shift the status quo? And because they were in fear that the things that Whitney was up there saying were going to shift the status quo when it came to the issues of racism, specifically we're speaking about these lynchings, they imprisoned her. And again, we also see how the criminalization of these women, how regularly throughout this entire book, anytime women have stood up against the status quo that was oppressing them and exploiting them, they've been criminalized for it. All right, so we are on page 161. All right, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. When Elizabeth Gurley Flynn died in 1964 at the age of 74, she had been active in socialist and communist causes for almost 60 years. Raised by parents who were members of the Socialist Party, she discovered, at an early age, her own affinity with the socialists' challenge to the capitalist class. The young Elizabeth was not yet 16 when she delivered her first public lecture in defense of socialism. Based on her readings of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women and August Bebel's Women and Socialism, she delivered a speech in 1906 at the Harlem Socialist Club entitled, quote, "What Socialism Will Do for Women," end quote. Although her somewhat, quote, male supremacist, end quote, father had been reluctant to allow Elizabeth to speak in public, the enthusiastic reception in Harlem caused him to change his mind. Accompanying her father, she became familiar with the street speaking, which was a typical radical tactic of the period. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn experienced her first arrest soon thereafter, charged with, quote, speaking without a permit, end quote. She was carted off to jail with her father. By the time Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was 16, her career as an agitator for the rights of the working class had been launched. Her first task was the defense of Big Bill Haywood, whose frame-up on criminal charges had been instigated by the Copper Trusts. During her westward travels on behalf of Haywood, she joined the IWW struggle in Montana and Washington. After 2 years as a Socialist Party member, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn became a leading IWW organizer. She resigned from the Socialist Party, quote, convinced that it was sterile and sectarian. Quote, convinced that it was sterile and sectarian compared with this grassroots movement that was sweeping the country, end quote. With an abundance of strike experiences behind her, including numerous clashes with the police, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn headed for Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912 with the textile workers when they went on strike. The grievances of the Lawrence workers were simple and compelling. In the words of Mary Heaton Vorse, quote, wages in Lawrence were so low that 35% of the people made under $7 a week. Less than a fifth got more than $12 a week. They were divided by nationality. They spoke over 40 languages and dialects, but they were united by meager living and the fact that their children died. For every 5 children under the age of 1 year old, 1 died. Only a few other towns in America had higher death rates. These were all mill towns, end quote. Of all the speakers addressing the strike meeting, said Vorse, who was covering these events for Harper's Weekly, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was the workers' most powerful inspiration. It was her words which encouraged them to preserve. Quote, when Elizabeth Gurley Flynn spoke, the excitement of the crowd became a visible thing. She stood there, young, with her Irish blue eyes, her face magnolia white and her cloud of black hair, the picture of a youthful revolutionary girl leader. She stirred them, lifted them up in her appeal for solidarity. It was as though a spurt of flame had gone through this audience, something stirring and powerful, a feeling which had made the liberation of people possible, end quote. As a traveling strike agitator for the IWW, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn sometimes worked alongside the well-known Native American Indian leader, Frank Little. In 1916, for example, they both represented the Wobblies during the Mesabi Iron Range strike in Minnesota. It was barely a year later when Elizabeth learned that Frank Little had been lynched in Butte, Montana. He had been attacked by a mob after making agitational speeches to the miners on strike in the area. Quote, 6 masked men came to the hotel at night, broke down the door, dragged Frank from his bed, took him to a railroad trestle on the outskirts of town, and there hanged him, end quote. A month following Frank Little's death, a federal indictment charged that 168 people had conspired with him, quote, to hinder the execution of certain laws of the United States, end quote. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was the only woman among the accused, and Ben Fletcher, a Philadelphia longshoreman and leader of the IWW, was the only black person named in the indictment. Judging from Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's autobiographical reflections, she was aware, from the very beginning of her political career, of the special oppression suffered by black people. Her consciousness of the importance of anti-racist struggles was doubtlessly intensified by her involvement in the IWW. The Wobblies publicly proclaimed that, quote, there is only one labor organization in the United States that admits the colored worker on a footing of absolute equality with the white, the industrial workers of the world. In the IWW, the colored worker, man or woman, is on an equal footing with every other worker, end quote. But the IWW was a syndicalist organization concentrating on industrial workers who, thanks to racist discrimination, were still overwhelmingly white. The tiny minority of black industrial workers included practically no women, who remained absolutely banned from industrial occupations. Indeed, most black workers, male and female alike, still worked in agricultural or domestic service. As a result, only a fraction of the black population could be reached through an industrial union, unless the union strenuously fought for black people's admission into industry. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn became active in the Communist Party in 1937 and emerged soon afterward as one of the organization's major leaders. Working on an intimate basis with such black communists as Benjamin Davis and Claudia Jones, she developed a new understanding of the central role of black liberation within the overall battle for the emancipation of the working class. In 1948, Flynn published an article in Political Affairs, the party's theoretical journal, on the meaning of International Women's Day. As she argued in this article, quote, the right to work, to training, upgrading, and equal seniority, safeguards for health and safety, adequate child care facilities, these remain the urgent demands of organized working women and are needed by all who toil, especially Negro women, end quote. Criticizing the inequality between women war veterans and men war veterans, she reminded her readers that black women veterans suffered to an even greater degree than their white sisters. Indeed, black women were generally caught in a threefold bond of oppression. Quote, every inequality and disability inflicted on American white women is aggravated 1,000-fold among Negro women, who are triply exploited as Negroes, as workers, and as women, end quote. This same, quote, triple jeopardy, end quote, analysis incidentally was later proposed by black women who sought to influence the early stages of the contemporary women's liberation movement. While Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's first autobiography, I Speak My Own Peace, or The Rebel Girl, provides fascinating glimpses into her experience as an IWW agitator, her second book, The Alderson Story, or My Life as a Political Prisoner, reveals a new political maturity and a more profound consciousness of racism. During the McCarthy-era assault on the Communist Party, Flynn was arrested in New York, along with 3 other women, and charged with, quote, teaching and advocating the violent overthrow of the government, end quote. The other women were Marion Bachrick, Betty Gannett, and Claudia Jones, a black woman from Trinidad who had immigrated to the United States as a young girl. In June 1951, the 4 communist women were taken by the police to the New York Women's House of Detention. The, quote, one pleasant episode, end quote, which, quote, lighted up our stay here, end quote, involved the birthday party which Elizabeth, Betty, and Claudia organized for one of the prisoners. Quote, discouraged and lonely, end quote, a 19-year-old black woman had, quote, happened to mention that the next day would be her birthday, end quote. The 3 women managed to obtain a cake from the commissary, Quote, we made candles of tissue paper for cake, covered the table as nicely as possible with paper napkins, and sang, happy birthday. We made speeches to her, and she cried with surprise and happiness. The next day we received a note from her as follows, exact spelling. Dear Claudia, Betty, and Elizabeth, I am very glad for what you did for me for my birthday. I really don't know how to thank you. Yesterday was one of the best years of my life. I think even though you are all communist people, that you are the best people I have ever met. The reason I put communist in this letter is because some people don't like communists for the simple reason they think communist people is against the American people, but I don't think so. I think that you are some of the nicest people I ever met in my whole 19 years of living, and I will never forget you all no matter where I be. I hope you all will get out of this trouble and never have to come back to a place like this." End quote. After the 3 women Smith Act trial, Marion Bachrick's health problems led to the severance of her case. They were convicted and sentenced to serve time in the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, Virginia. Shortly before they arrived, the prison had been placed under court order to desegregate its facilities. Another Smith Act victim, Dorothy Rose Blumberg from Baltimore, had already served a portion of her 3-year sentence as one of the first white prisoners to be housed with black women. Quote, "We felt both amused and flattered that communists were called upon to help integrate prison houses." End quote. Yet, as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn pointed out, the legal desegregation of the prisons' cottages did not have the result of ending racial discrimination. The black women continued to be assigned to the hardest jobs, quote, "on the farm, in the cannery, in maintenance, and at the piggery until it was abolished," end quote. As a leader of the Communist Party, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had developed a deep commitment to the black liberation struggle and had come to realize that black people's resistance is not always consciously political. She observed that among the prisoners in Alderson, quote, "there was greater solidarity among Negro women, undoubtedly a result of life outside, especially in the South. It seemed to me that they were of better character, by and large, stronger and more dependable, with less inclination to tattle or to be a stool pigeon than the white inmates," end quote. She made friends more easily among the black women in prison than she did among the white inmates. Quote, "Frankly, I trusted the Negro women more than I did the whites. They were more controlled, less hysterical, less spoiled, more mature," end quote. And the black women, in turn, were more receptive to Elizabeth. Perhaps they sensed in this white woman communist an instinctive kinship and struggle. And then that brings us to the end of reading about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, sorry. That brings us to the end of reading about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And again, this is a historical figure who I had not heard about before reading through this book. So I'm thankful to have my perspective widened, to have my understanding of history widened with more people's perspectives. I think one of the things that stands out in here is the fact that these women were sentenced to prison and that these women were sentenced to prison, and it just continues to show you how often in this country the people who are being criminalized are the people who are on the right side of history, are the people who are actually living up to the ideals that this country is proclaims to have. And I think that again, this woman pointed out, or the passage that we read about this woman points out the importance of understanding intersectionality, the importance of understanding how specifically black women are have a triple jeopardy is what they called it in here. How certain black women, the masses of black women, have this triple jeopardy that they spoke about here as far as being black, being workers, and being women. And again, one of the things that has been a regularity throughout this that I pointed to is how we have to be cognizant of that as we are building movements, as we are organizing, being cognizant of people who fall into multiple categories of jeopardy, who have these double jeopardies, triple jeopardies, quadruple jeopardies because of the categories that they fall in. And then again, she pointed out, or her life gives testimony to the importance of understanding the integral part of any movement that black people will play. Any movement in this society, any movement in this country that is toward a more equitable society, that is toward a more humane society, is going to have black people and people of color at the center of it, because those are the groups that deal with the most inhumane parts of our country and our society, that deal with the least equitable parts of our country and our society. And so we got one more passage to read in this chapter, but we're going to save that for another episode because we're a little bit over a little bit over 30 minutes here. So I want to encourage people to please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you're listening on Spotify, subscribe, or Apple Podcast, subscribe, Anchor, subscribe, whatever you got to follow, whatever each platform has. There's a way for you to be notified when these episodes come out, and we'll be back tomorrow with another episode. If you haven't listened to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily, I encourage you to please go back and listen to those. We outside.